Do you ever wish that someone had given you or would give you a heads up about the pitfalls of communication in marriage?
Let's get into that. Hey, I'm Andrea Warnock.
I'm Nathan Warnock.
And you're joining us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. Marriage Monday is a time where we talk about God's design for marriage and how we live that out.
That's right. And this month, we have been talking all about communication. So we talked in week 1 about what communication versus dialogue, why it can be so difficult within particularly the marriage relationship. Last week, we talked about the pyramid of communication. What it is that we spend our time dialoguing and communicating about, and how often the communication that really builds intimacy within our relationships really never gets cracked within the marriage relationship. So we talked quite a bit about what each of those stages were and how we can focus more on those things within our marriage. So this week, we're going to talk about barriers to communication. Now, this is a huge category.
Yes, a long list.
Right, and certainly each one of these items that we're going to cover today, we could probably spend at least a week on each one of those, if not an entire month. In fact, some of them we will spend an entire month on later on in the podcast, or have already spent a month doing a series on in some cases as well. So certainly, by listening to this episode, what we really want is to kind of put these things in your mind, and you may recognize a few of them and go, oh man, that's a barrier to communication in our relationship right now. And what we want to do is just present a few of these and maybe talk through a little bit about how we can combat these within the marriage relationship. Now, if you've watched Andrea and my story, you know it was a wreck, and you can assume, and probably would rightfully assume, that we have had almost every one of these things that we're going to talk about over the next 20 or 25 minutes within our own marriage.
Definitely.
So, totally, this is not from a place of, hey, if you deal with this, what's wrong with you? This is coming from a place of, man, we all deal with these things from time to time. Here's how we can recognize those and combat them.
Right. Yeah, so we were really brainstorming some of these sorts of things. And one of the things that we talked about is just emotion.
Yeah.
Like, emotion can be a barrier to communication just in feeling like I'm going to get too emotional about this, or I don't want to expose my emotion, or it's just too emotional to talk about this thing that I want to talk about, and I don't want to get into that, because that can be taxing.
You bet.
Sometimes. You ever feel like that, Nathan?
Sure.
Do you?
Sure. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I can definitely have that problem at times where I'm like, oh, I know this is going to be such an emotional conversation, and I just don't want to go there.
Right, and sometimes you can fall into that habit. It's kind of a form of procrastination, really.
Yeah.
Where you just, you don't feel like it. We'll do it. Let's do it tomorrow. And then the next day you don't feel like it. And pretty soon a conversation that needs to be had has been pushed off and pushed off and pushed off. And particularly if it's something that your spouse really wants to talk about, they feel like they've been pushed off and pushed off.
Yeah, which is not good. Right.
Exactly. So how do we combat that?
Yeah. I would say the first thing for all of these is prayer. Right?
Sure.
So,
given the Sunday school answer, babe,
prayer.
Good work.
I think sometimes if you feel like your emotion is going to get in the way of communicating effectively, sometimes just sitting with that conversation yourself.
Yeah.
That sounds really clinical or whatever, but maybe talking through with yourself or with the Lord. How you feel about that, and kind of getting some of that emotion out beforehand if you feel like it's going to be maybe detrimental to the conversation, but also being okay with accepting things are emotional sometimes.
Sure.
And maybe we just need to leave space in our conversation with each other for one or the both of us to work through some emotion. Now that may look like I need to stop talking so that I can cry. Or I need to walk away for 2 minutes so I can get my anger under control.
Right. Yeah, and I think communicating those emotions, I think, is helpful. And recognizing that, particularly as Christians, while God has given us emotion as a gift, we're not to be people that are driven by our emotions.
Yeah.
Right? Christ was not driven by his emotions. And you're right, he combated those things by, one, being in constant communication with his Father, right? And allowing the Holy Spirit to lead in the things. But Jesus also showed his emotion. I mean, he showed his emotion in the temple when he saw people perverting what the temple was meant to be. He showed his emotion when one of his best friends, Lazarus, died. And he showed up. And interestingly, even Jesus probably knew at the time that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and yet he cried.
Yeah.
Because he recognized death as such a sting on humanity, and he showed that emotion, but he was not driven by those emotions. Yeah, I think what you said is really good. Being able to step away for a moment. I would say on the other end, as the spouse that may know, hey, we need to have a conversation and it's probably going to get emotional, don't ambush your spouse with the conversation. I mean, it can be really easy to go, hey, I know this is going to be emotional, and if I give him or her a heads up, they're not going to want to deal with it, so I'm just going to launch. Man, I would highly suggest you don't do that if you want to have good dialogue on an issue. In fact, I would suggest going the other way and saying, hey, there's something we need to talk about. I got in a car accident today, and we need to have a conversation about that. I don't want to ambush you with it, so later tonight, once you get home from work, can we talk about that, or whatever, right? But to give them a heads up and give them an opportunity to process some of that emotion, and hopefully come to a recognition of, okay, I need to calm down so we can effectively dialogue about this.
Just two other things I would say about emotion. We should never be using emotion to manipulate our spouse or anybody else for that matter. Real emotion, totally fine. Don't use emotion for manipulation purposes. And also on the other side of things, don't assume that your spouse is trying to use emotion to manipulate.
Yeah, good call.
If you suspect that, maybe you should talk about that in a different conversation. But, just because somebody has emotions that are different from you doesn't mean that they're trying to manipulate you with that. So
It's great.
What's the next one you would say?
So next one we're going to talk about, and these are in no particular order. We kind of just brainstormed them and wrote them down. But the next one that we had talked about was dishonesty. So how does dishonesty come in as a barrier to communication?
Well, if you're not willing to be honest, you're probably not going to want to talk about it, right?
Right.
Or if you feel like your spouse is being dishonest, that communication, then you can just run bunny trails.
Sure.
All over everywhere.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. I mean, and I would even go as far as to say, you're not really communicating and dialoguing if you're not being honest. Even if your spouse doesn't know you're not being honest.
Right.
That's not true communication and dialogue. You're basically selling a con to your spouse, even in the little stuff. Right? So when we communicate and dialogue, we need to be people of complete transparency and honesty. Yep.
And that builds your marriage, it builds intimacy, always being honest about everything. Yeah, and I mean, the way to combat that is to choose honesty.
Right, and it may be difficult, right? There may be times when you need to perhaps ask another couple to be a part of the conversation, a mentor couple that you have, right? Where maybe you have already spoken to, if you're the guy to him or the girl to her, and you have, said, hey, there's this conversation I need to have, here's the situation, and they can hold you accountable to not taking the easy way out and sliding into sort of coloring things a more rosy way or whatever. So, certainly accountability can be helpful as far as that goes. But yeah, with honesty, you kind of just got to do it.
Yep. Small step by small step. I mean, I'm going to be honest this time, and then I'm going to be honest the next time. And
Right. Yeah. And transparent. I mean, that's I know those are kind of synonyms, but Sometimes we think, oh, I can be honest without necessarily being fully transparent.
Yeah, very true.
And that's not true. And that actually ties into the next one, which is prior mistakes.
Yeah, so tell us about that.
So perhaps you have a history of not being honest, right? Or perhaps you've made mistakes in the past that really hurt your spouse. Those can really be a barrier to communication, because rather than coming into a conversation being engaged in this conversation becomes just an extension of this wrong thing that you already did, even though the conversation might be completely unrelated.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if I had issues in the past of being dishonest, and I'm having a conversation with Andrea about something completely unrelated, a barrier to communication is her in her own mind going right to, or maybe worse, even expressing, you're probably just lying again. Mm-hmm. Even though it might have nothing to do with that prior mistake. Now, look at, some people are compulsive liars. So I'm not talking about always assuming the best about someone.
Right.
What I'm saying is coming into a conversation not stacking the deck against the person that's trying to enter into that conversation.
Can be so hard.
Sure.
Yeah, based on some history.
Right. So how do we combat that?
Lots of prayer.
Yeah. I mean, not only prayer, but really pursuing the Lord on forgiveness.
I was going to say, it leads right into another one.
Right. See how we chain these together? We are killing this. So the next one that we have, and we'll kind of tie these in together, is...
So a barrier is unforgiveness or bitterness.
Yeah.
And that can be a huge barrier to communication, because you're coming into this conversation or this dialogue with already this enormous wall and probably assumption, lots of them built up, which makes it so difficult to have really deep communication or effective communication.
Makes it really difficult too to not fall into the trap of having an evil for evil situation in your communication, where you come into it really wanting to win the conversation, because think of what this person did to me, you know, I'm not going to let them hurt me again or whatever, even though not all communication and dialogue is hurtful. But when you come into it with that thought process of, well, I'm not letting them get the upper hand in this, it makes every conversation and dialogue combative.
The thing that I have found in marriage is, if I come into a conversation, if I come into a situation with Nathan where I'm trying to win, I've lost already. Because we're supposed to be on the same team, right? So if I'm trying to win, I'm trying to win against my teammate. That doesn't make any sense. And so if I'm trying to win, everyone's a loser, right?
Yeah.
Totally. So
I mean, to be clear, I'm not a loser. So.
We're all. I mean, if that's the goal, then don't have the conversation right then.
That's right. Yep.
Hold it for another time, because you're not going to get anywhere.
It's the opposite of dialogue. If you go back and listen to what we talked about dialogue, it was a mutual understanding.
Right.
A two-way conversation with the specific goal of mutual understanding.
Right.
So if you have any mentality of who's winner and loser,
or even like,
it's not going to work.
Coming into it, I'm going to take him to the mat, you know.
Right.
That's all about unforgiveness and bitterness, and you're going to have barrier upon barrier with communication if that's
right. Now, this is one area where our emotions can be helpful, because you may find that for whatever reason, every time you go to have a conversation with your spouse at any kind of deeper than, 4 or 5 level, you start feeling angry, you start feeling frustrated, you start getting edgy. Those can be real helpful signs from the Lord that there's some unforgiveness or bitterness that you're dealing with that needs to be taken before him.
Absolutely.
Right? And true forgiveness given. Forgiveness which says, what you owe me for the wrongs you've committed me,
Is nothing.
I'm letting that go.
Mhm.
Right? Not for my glory, but for his.
Yes.
Totally. And unforgiveness and bitterness, guys, is something we will cover. We'll take a whole month talking about unforgiveness and
It's a
bitterness because
tough
it is a difficult topic.
with a lot to unpack on that.
And a lot of misunderstanding about what unforgiveness is, what it's not. There's a lot of cute sayings about, you forgive and forget. And if you believe that, you need to watch our future episodes about unforgiveness and bitterness. And we will talk about whether that is a biblical concept or
It's
not. Spoilers. No, they don't have to watch. All right.
Okay, so lack of trust.
Lack of trust.
Is something that we talked about too. I would say, cannot have deep communication with somebody when there's lack of trust.
Yeah.
Because then I'm wondering, what are you going to do with this information? I can't fully trust to be fully transparent. I can't fully trust that what I'm telling you, you're not going to throw back at me or use, take that and tell somebody else or whatever. So, if there is a lack of trust, then that's something that you should be communicating on and dialoguing about too. Right. If you're recognizing lack of trust is something that really is a barrier to our communication, then we need to have some real good conversation about trust in our marriage and how we can, what we need to do about that, what we don't trust each other about.
Right.
And come together in prayer on that too.
Right, and the next couple are really kind of spin-offs of that, which the first one is fear of response, which really is a lack of trust of your
it's just
of your
kind
spouse.
of different direction of it.
Right. I mean, there are oftentimes situations where a conversation's not had because you're afraid of how your spouse is going to respond.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I would rather let's just let this go, and then we won't have to deal with the uncomfortableness of how my spouse is going to respond, that fear of confrontation.
Yeah.
And really, the way to move past that as a barrier is to understand that ultimately your relationship, your transparency with your spouse is out of respect and love for the Lord, not for your spouse. So when we choose to have the difficult confrontation conversations, it should be because we recognize, for the glory of our marriage, for the glory of the oneness that the Lord has given us in our marriage, this conversation needs to be had. Look, if you're having a whole bunch of conversations that are eliciting tons of emotional responses, I mean, I would say there is certainly some benefit to really sitting down and thinking, okay, do all of these conversations really need to be had?
Sure.
Like, are there some of these dialogues and communications where that's not helpful?
Mm-hmm.
This is maybe something I just need to process. Again, not out of hiding it or being dishonest on who you are with your spouse, but because maybe it's just not benefiting the marriage to be bringing up whatever this particular thing is. Could be that there's something that, man, you guys are having a hard time getting past, and every time you bring it up, it needs to be dealt with, but every time it gets brought up, it devolves into this emotional response war. Maybe what you need to do is invite a couple that you look up to, maybe from your church or Bible study, invite them into your home, and they can just sit there quietly. Because what we found is the emotional responses go way down when you invite someone, a couple you respect, into your home just to have that same conversation, right? They don't have to say a word. Just, you guys sit there, we're going to talk about this thing we've had a hard time getting through. Yeah, because you're on your best behavior. Right. Because somebody else is in the room. So, there you go.
Yeah, that's good. It's true. It works.
Not that we know from personal experience.
So, yes, we do. We do.
All right, what's next, babe?
Lack of security.
Yep.
Which is sort of can be part of the response to one, but just lack of security in your relationship. when you're not that relationship is sort of tenuous, bringing up a heavy piece of conversation, it can feel like I don't know what's going to happen next,
Right.
and that's hard. And again, I would say with that, is it important to bring it up now? If it is, pray about it lots, and just baby step lightly with how you're bringing that up.
Yeah.
And know that God is the one who holds your heart, and you have all security in Him.
Right.
So yeah. Do you have anything to say on that?
No, that's good.
Okay. One you had said is lack of self-esteem.
Yeah. So one point, I'm going to combine this with, because as we kind of talked about this, I think it really goes along with the next one as well, which is idolatry, which probably seems like a strange thing to put on this list. This is one that the Lord has really given me some insight in over the last year or so, of how we, particularly as husbands, can idolize serenity in the marriage and our wives' serenity. And so when we have to have conversations that are confrontational and difficult, we just want to not do that at all, right? Or we start the conversation, and I'm speaking from a guy's perspective, that's why I keep using my husband and wife, but for me, if I bring something up to Andrea and she has a really emotional response, man, it can throw me totally out of whack, right? I start getting upset and frustrated, and I don't just mean in the conversation, I mean with my kids for the next day, and it can really throw me out of whack. And the thing that I've realized over the last year is I really am idolizing that tranquility in my marriage, and Andrea being calm and smiley, and look at, guys, the reality is sometimes things happen in the grind of life where we have to have confrontational conversations, and our spouse isn't going to react the way we want them to react.
Yeah.
That's their response, right? Their response is their responsibility. Us bringing the conversation up may be our responsibility at the time because it's something that needs to be talked about. And for us to put that serenity of the home and the peacefulness of our spouse up on a pedestal above what we know to be having a conversation the Lord needs us to have, right? For one reason or another. Maybe it's about something important. Maybe it's about something He told you, right? To put our peace and spouse on a pedestal above having that conversation the Lord needs you to have, that's idolatry. That's what that is.
That's an interesting way to put it. I would have never thought about it that way, but it is true. Yeah.
I think it can really be a barrier to communication. Peace above all costs.
Right.
Peace at all costs.
Yep. So another one I had thought of is just lack of introspection. That realizing how I feel about things, or think about things, or whatever. I think that can be a barrier to communication, which seems odd, but then maybe you're not even communicating the things that are important because you don't even know what's important.
Sure.
Or how you feel about something.
Sure.
Or maybe your spouse is trying to communicate with you and you don't have anything to say because you haven't really thought about it. And you're not willing to think about it because that might be painful. So that introspection part is so important for communication, because that's a way to be transparent, because there's something to be transparent about. So just taking the time every day, if you need to. Some people are just naturally good at this, but some people may need to take specific time every day to think about, how do I feel, like generally? What's going on in my life? What do I think about it? How do I feel about what's going on? What's going on in my heart? All that sort of thing.
It's good.
Yeah, you don't really have to struggle with that. That can be a struggle for me sometimes.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I know it was a big deal early on in our marriage, and you've grown in that a ton.
Yeah, it's crazy, but some people just don't really know how they feel about things.
Sure.
So.
Sure. Yeah. Totally.
Um.
Okay. Next one
Kids!
It's not just one barrier in our home. It's
Four.
four barriers in our home.
Kids can be such
Children.
a barrier to communication, and
That's right.
we struggle with this every day because it's like we have a conversation and somebody interrupts, or we are trying to continue on a conversation and somebody, one of the kids starts crying because they're hurt or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Anyway, kids, they're a huge barrier to communication and dialogue. And sometimes our solution to that is to tell them, hey guys, I'm trying to talk to your dad right now. I need you to be quiet for 5 minutes. I need you to leave me alone for 5 minutes or whatever.
Sure.
So sometimes it's just letting your kids know the priority in that moment is having a conversation with my spouse. Or it may be waiting until all the kids are in bed and then you can have conversation without being interrupted.
Yep.
Or without a time limit.
Yep.
Get away, find a babysitter. There's all sorts of solutions you can have.
As a side note, I would also say, and this is bleeding into our Family Friday series about structure for this month, but this is also an important reason why your kids need to have a set bedtime.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least a go away time. Right? I mean, as your kids get older and you're not tucking them maybe into bed, it's hey, at this time of the evening you disappear. And you can go these areas of the house or your room or down the basement where the entertainment stuff is or whatever, but you need to go away.
Yeah.
Because your mom and I need to hang out.
Sure.
And I mean, that's another part of it is that one way you can really combat this with your kids is train your kids when they're young that I love you very much as my children. I love her more. And that relationship is paramount to any relationship I will ever have with you.
Mm-hmm.
And as your kids know that when they're young, there's this built-in sort of respect of, okay, it makes sense that I need to respect the fact that they need to have some conversation because at the end of the day, Dad likes her more than me. And that's okay, right? We joke about it within our home.
Yeah.
And our kids know that we love them, but they know that our relationship, yours and mine, is paramount.
Right. Yep. Busyness.
Yeah.
I would say that's another big barrier to
Yep.
communication. It's shocking, but so true that tons of marriages get to the emptiness point of their relationship and realize we don't even really know each other. We've been raising kids and don't really even know each other. I'm not even sure if I like you. And that just is busyness.
Tragic.
And the busyness, if this is what one of your barriers, you need to go through your schedule and just start crossing things out. And maybe that's the
that
best
might be a
thing.
difficult dialogue.
Yes, that might be a difficult dialogue. But maybe that's the best thing, not only for your relationship with communication, but for your kids too.
Yeah, that's right.
It's so good to have space in your week or whatever where there's rest.
Yeah.
Rest is so important.
Yeah, and ask yourself when you do that as a couple, you might be involved in a lot of things that are good, but how many things are you involved in that are God ordained?
Yes.
For your life, right? So those 18 different church activities that you're involved in, that's great. But how many of those things do you and your spouse feel like God told us to be involved in this?
Yeah.
I mean, that helps to narrow down some of the things that you're involved in,
Yeah.
right? It's God's church. He'll figure it out, right? But you need to be in the things he's asked you to be in and then be engaged in each other and in your family outside of that.
Right. And the last one is spider webbing.
So what does that mean, man?
Right. Let's do a spider web. So Nathan, today I was driving to the store and I saw this lady. Oh, and as I was driving, I went by McDonald's and I realized I'm really hungry. So I went to get a hamburger, and as I was getting a hamburger, I realized, so I used coins to pay for it because we're in a coin shortage right now. So I found all these coins in the car. It took me forever to try to get all the coins together because I was just kind of finding them on the floor of the car, which, did you know the floor of our car is so dirty? We really need to get a car wash. Can we get a membership for a car wash place? Do you see what I did there? I never actually... I don't really spiderweb though very often. But I never actually finished my the thing that I was going to tell him.
Right.
He probably doesn't even remember the thing that I was trying to tell him. I just started saying something, and then I thought of something else, and then I thought of something else.
Bunny trails. That's
Yes.
another commonly
So
used
it's a
term
funny
for this.
thing to act out, but it's a very frustrating thing a very frustrating situation to try to have a conversation with somebody who spider webs.
Yeah.
So if
And women, you guys are amazing at this, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Like oftentimes,
yeah, because spider webs are in a circle, right?
right?
So women can
you're-
start the circle here and go here, and then eventually
right,
come
you'll
back.
tie them all back together. Like there's every single part of that story will be brought to a conclusion, but meanwhile, the other people listening are like, "Oh my gosh, what is happening right now?" And it can be really exhausting and confusing. Maybe it's just maybe I'm not intelligent enough for this. I'm happy to admit that, but it's difficult for me to be like,
Where are we going?
I don't know what part of this to dialogue with you on because you just had half of 18 conversations.
Yep. So if spiderwebbing is your issue, my only suggestion that I can think of is like really try to stay on target.
And
really try to. I'm going to talk to you about what happened to me at the store.
Right.
And then you can start, and if you start veering off, maybe your spouse can say, "What we're talking about, what happened to you at the store," and
Right.
kind of get back on.
Yeah, and giving your spouse permission to be able to do that, which this takes some introspection to realize I'm a spider webber. And giving your spouse, if that's frustrating to them, giving your spouse freedom to say, "Hey, you're kind of losing me right now. I thought we were talking about this, and now you're talking about this." And you can practice the humility to go, yeah. Hold on a second. I'll let me go back to what I was first saying, and maybe it's helpful for you to have like a notepad with you in those types of conversations where you can make a note, car wash, so that you remember.
Come back to that.
Yeah, I wanted to come back and ask you about that, but it doesn't really tie into what I'm talking about right now.
Right.
It helps everybody stay on the same page, and it keeps the conversation from getting really frustrating for both of you because you're keeping up, right? You know all the conversations you're having, so when the other person isn't keeping up, it's like, are you even listening? Right?
Yeah.
Well, it's not a listening problem for them.
Yep.
So, well, guys, I hope this gave you just a few examples
Yeah.
of some barriers to communication. I'm sure
curious
there are
what you would
tons of
say.
others
What do you feel like is your biggest barrier?
out of these ones we talked about.
Yeah.
For me, probably the idolatry one. I think that's why the Holy Spirit's kind of been working with me on that. Like, I feel like I can, particularly with some of our past and the angry fights we would have till all hours of the night. There's always that little fleshly part of me that's like, I don't really want to run the risk of having a fight.
Yeah, and totally. There's definitely some fights I've been ridiculously mean in, and still times where, of course, definitely times where I do not communicate with you in a way that's God honoring.
What about you? What would you say your
Fear of response.
Really?
Yeah, because I don't know. I have this thing in me where I really hate a disappointed response from you, or an annoyed response, or I really hate it, and so that can be a barrier for me.
Yeah.
Which
It's good.
Yeah, which maybe sort of lean into the idolatry piece
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah, I can see how those would be related.
Oh man, I'm learning so much sitting here in this chair.
Well, guys, thanks so much for tuning in on our own little talk back and forth about where we struggle in dialogue. I hope you guys, in all seriousness, I hope you guys have a few things to think about. Man, if nothing else, having listened to this, I would encourage you, sit down with your spouse and just say, hey, what do you feel like is the biggest barrier that we have to dialogue in our marriage right now? And have some conversation over that.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that'd be good.
Awesome, guys. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. So we've got a whole week of shows for you this week. Testosterone Tuesday, Women Power Wednesday. We're going to continue going through what a personal relationship with God looks like. Then we've got Thirsty Thursday, continuing to talk about the nerve chapter. And then Family Friday. So if you have comments, guys, thoughts on things that trip you up in your communication, please put them down in the comments below. Post them up on our Facebook page. Love that kind of feedback from you guys to be able to see what it is that you guys are dealing with and how you've combated that in your own marriage. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. And remember, God is for your marriage.
Hey, thanks for joining us on Marriage by Design. If you were impacted by this video, like it by hitting the thumbs up below. Also, don't forget to subscribe, and once you subscribe, hit the bell icon so you can be notified when new episodes release.
Excellent. Also, one of the huge pillars of our show is interactivity between us and you. So we would love you to comment down in the comments below if you have thoughts about this video, or if you have questions or other things you'd like to see considered in the future. In addition, if you'd like, you can email us. That's marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Instagram @marriagebydesignpodcast, or you can find us on Facebook by searching Marriage by Design Podcast. Finally, if you want to, you can tweet at us. We do have a Twitter account that is @MarriageXDesign. Thanks, and have a great day.